And so many of the things that we try to tell people to make them feel better are the exact opposite of what makes them feel better. So a common example is like, oh, they're in a better place. A lot of like the spiritual things can really get to people. And like for me, I'm at a point where it's like, I do feel like James is in a better place. But when you tell me that right after he dies, like that's not what I want to hear right now. And I know again, that's so hard because it's like then people get scared to say the wrong thing. But I think it's important to it's not your job to make the person feel better. And you don't have to worry about making them feel better. You just have to include them in things.
Welcome to Critical Thinking Required, hosted by LBW. This podcast is intended for free thinkers, entrepreneurs, and knowledge seekers. Join us as we discuss relevant financial topics, explore with guests their financial journeys, and engage with experts in industries such as space, media and entertainment, real estate, and many more. Buckle up and enjoy the ride. Welcome to Critical Thinking Required. You're with your host, myself, Tim Bickmore, and my colleague, Dan Weiss. Nathaniel Leach has the day off today, but we have a wonderful guest. We have the wonderful Michelle Vande Hey with us of Light of Love Coaching. This is going to be a really interesting conversation. Michelle helps, I'll read it in her bio, but she helps women who are grieving a loss of a loved one. Could be a death of a child, a parent, a sibling. And so we want to talk about that and talk a little bit about just in general what Michelle does, but then also discuss this on a financial and a behavioral side. This is a very emotional time for many people. And so it's something that we actually do witness within our own practice. And it's something that is not always talked about, but probably should be talked about from a financial perspective. So thank you, Michelle, so much for joining. We really do appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Of course. And before I jump into the bio, what I'm going to do is I just want to let everyone know that if you like our stuff, please share, subscribe, and like to our podcast. Make an Apple podcast comment. It just helps other people find some of the stuff that we're trying to promote from an educational point of view. It would be really helpful for us, so we would appreciate it. Okay, so I'm going to, just for our listeners and viewers, Michelle, I'm going to read out your bio quick, just to kind of give everybody up to speed on who you are and what you're doing. So today we have Michelle Vande Hey, who helps women who feel lost, alone, unhealthy, and unmotivated after the death of a child, sibling, partner, or parent to feel healthy, whole, and worthy of love again so they can reclaim their identity and live life on purpose. As a certified holistic life coach who has experienced the death of a child, Michelle has the training and life experience to empower these women. Michelle, again, thank you for joining us. Dan, do you want to kick us off on some questions for Michelle?
I would be honored to do so. And yes, Michelle, thank you for joining us. And this is a subject matter, like Tim said, that we come across, unfortunately, way too often. But it is a poor part of life. It does get avoided. It should be discussed. There are financial implications. And we know, as your bio just stated too, that this kind of education is both formal and then also experience-based. And you yourself, having experienced some great loss in your life, really have just been a beacon to many people that we know. So this is a very different experience for everybody, of course. And I mean, I can speak from a personal viewpoint. I mean, I have at times, and I know others that have too. It's very difficult to address with people. You just don't know what to say when somebody has had a loss like this. And a lot of times I know that the person who's experienced loss, they don't know where to begin either, what to say to people, what to do, and so on. It's a very lost feeling. Can we perhaps start there with the grieving process? Where do people begin?
That is such a hard question because you're right. Like everyone experiences this on a different level and experiences it, I feel like, in different waves and from different viewpoints. And I think sometimes it does change depending on the person that has died. I know like my nephew died a couple years before my son died, and they're both tragic losses, but the loss of my son affected me differently than my nephew. And I think the best thing, like where to start, especially for supporters, for people who are trying to support people, is just letting that person know that you're there for them, and not being afraid to reach out to them, because it can feel like such a lonely place, to when your person dies, that it's just like it feels so lonely and alone. And when people stop reaching out to you, it gets even lonelier. So especially after, after a funeral or some sort of service that happens, it's like everyone else seems to go back to their regular lives, but then you're kind of still in this like, I don't really know what my life is. And it starts getting quiet. And that's when like a lot of the loneliness really comes in, I feel like, and that isolation, especially over the last 2 years, the feeling of isolation has really been amplified. And so just anytime, I say this to the women, my clients too, it's like anytime someone's name pops into your head, whether it's grief related or not, you should always reach out to that person, because there's a reason their name popped into your head and you might not know why. And that like energetic level of like someone really probably needing someone to reach out to them, but you don't even really realize it. And you're that person, and you might not know why you're that person. And it's not like you have to say anything profound to them. It's just that reaching out and saying, hey, how are you today? And letting them just know that you're thinking about them and thinking about their person too. I think that's a big like myth, is that we shouldn't talk about the person that died. And it's actually the exact opposite. We feel so alone when it's like people don't want to talk about James, my son who died, or they don't want to like say his name. And it's like they it, people think that they have the power to make us sad because they bring up our children or our person. And it's like, I was already sad before. It's like you bringing him up is actually probably not going to make me sad. It's probably going to make me happy that you're remembering him. So that's, yeah, so that is really helpful to reach out to people and say their person's name.
Interesting. And so I am curious to kind of go a little bit further on that subject, because I feel it's always difficult, and I'm curious on both sides of the perspective. A, the person who's the supporter, and then B, the person who is the affected or afflicted person, who is like experiencing loss. I sometimes find it difficult on what words to say as a supporter, because I totally agree. I think it's always nice to be able to reach out, but then what to say, how to say it without telling somebody like thank you, but like I don't really need to hear that, like, oh, I'm so sorry for your loss. A lot of people are like, well, I don't, like, thanks, but that's not really not doing anything for me. So I'm just curious on how to approach it from the supporter's perspective that is beneficial, and then how the person who's experiencing loss also feels that can be better or more appropriate, I guess would be a good way to say that.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I know from my own experience, it's, you do kind of get sick of people just saying, I'm sorry. Like it does. I got to a point where I'm just like, I don't even care that you're sorry. It's like, you just like feel like I'm so sick of people telling me that they're sorry. And so, but it's like, you're right. It's like, we don't know what to say. And I think one of the most important things you can say is, I'm here for you and I'm thinking about you. And you don't even like, you don't have to say I'm sorry, especially if you've already said that to that person too. And just letting them know that you're there for them. And I think the other thing too, especially early on in grief, is saying, hey, I'm thinking about you. And I just want you to know that I love you, or what, like whatever you want to say about them, just say how you feel about that person and that you're thinking about them, and let them know that they don't have to respond back, because especially early in grief, and like, and then if you start feeling depressed and all of those types of things, like responding to a text can be one of the hardest. Responding to anyone, it takes so much energy that it seems like it shouldn't take that much energy, but it takes so much energy, and it can be so difficult to actually respond. So anytime I reach out to someone that's having a hard time, it's just like, I just say like, hey, I'm thinking about you and I love you, or whatever, that kind of stuff. And then just say, don't worry about responding. I know you saw this, but you don't have to respond to me. Especially again, early on, because they're getting cards and and meals and all that kind of stuff. And that stuff is very valuable too. I think the other thing that can be really helpful is, instead of saying, how can I help you, tell them like, hey, text them and say, hey, I'm dropping off a meal by your front door. You can ask if they're around, but if you know that they're around, you can just say, hey, I'm dropping off a meal by your front door. Or I am coming to pick up your kids from school today. I'm going to drop them off for you, or something like that. Like, actually offer the help and just say that you're doing it, instead of asking what they need help with, because 90% of the time they're just going to say, I'm fine. Like, don't worry about it. Because again, it's like, when you're in that like depressive state, it's like nothing really matters to you anymore. It's like, you don't care about eating, you don't care about showering, you don't care about doing the laundry, like all of those things. And so being able to just say, hey, I'm gonna come over and do your dishes for you, or I'm gonna come over and bring you a coffee. What time can I come over in 15 minutes, and see if they respond or to something like that.
Michelle, how would you, so for the person who has suffered this loss, or people, how, if you were coaching a person who has suffered a loss, like how does someone dealing with these emotions and stresses, how should they address work, and what is the most helpful way for like the workplace to address them?
And work can be so difficult. It's interesting because I feel like it's almost two different people. One person wants to go right back to work and just do. And the other person is like, cannot even imagine going back to work right now. And I think hopefully wherever they're working, there's some HR person. And honestly, even if it's not an HR person, but just someone that you're connected with at work, that can kind of be your person to go to when you're struggling, and that they can kind of be that person that will be the middle person for you and everybody else at work. So if you're having a hard time, if something specific comes up, you can go to that person and they can relay the message to everyone. So you don't have to feel like you're having to repeat yourself all the time. And I think so often people think that they have to say something, and you don't have to say anything. It's better to just say hi, or like, you don't have to feel like you have to make people feel better. And I think that's what we always try, is like, we're trying to make someone feel better. And so many of the things that we try to tell people to make them feel better are the exact opposite of what makes them feel better. So a common example is like, oh, they're in a better place. A lot of like the spiritual things can really get to people. And like, for me, I'm at a point where it's like, I do feel like James is in a better place. But when you tell me that right after he dies, like, that's not what I want to hear right now. Or like God needed him more, or something like that. Like, those things don't make someone feel better. And in fact, is like, can be really feel like alienating almost. And I know, again, that's so hard, because it's like, then people get scared to say the wrong thing. But I think it's important to it's not your job to make the person feel better. And you don't have to worry about making them feel better. You just have to include them in things.
Gotcha. And that's really interesting. This was I feel like I always bring up my mother sometimes as examples, but it was a very stark reality. I haven't had very many really close people pass in my lifetime thus far. I'm lucky enough to have younger grandparents and different things, and a lot of people healthy. But my grandfather on my mom's side passed away. It's coming up like 3 or 4 years ago, and very, very close to him. Grew up with him, and when he passed, and it was a very peaceful passing. My grandpa used to always say constantly, "I just need to go to I just need to die." He'd say it 5 years before he passed. It's all he would say constantly, and it was almost kind of like a joke. But when I saw my mom for the first time after his passing, and I had said, well, he got, he got what he wanted to, he got what he wanted. And my mom's response to me was like, yeah, but that doesn't mean I can't be heartbroken. And it was just it was a very sobering experience in the sense that it still is hard, even though it may be something he wanted. And I just never had looked at it like that before, which has really made me more hypersensitive to people that, like, even though someone has passed, it maybe it was because they were sick, they were old, whatever it may be, it's still heartbreaking, irregardless of the cause. And which makes me think a lot about what you just mentioned, in the sense of, like, you don't just always want to say things like, oh, they're in a better place, or something spiritual or religious, given that matter. And I bring this up in the sense that my next question really goes around like managing these feelings. And I'm curious on both sides. Like, you talked a little bit about it, where I do feel like sometimes it is hard on the supporter side, that you do feel like you're walking on eggshells, because you don't want to inflict more pain. You don't want to say the wrong thing. You do want to make them feel better. And I guess I'm really more curious too, is like, what does somebody on the other side going through that experience, what do they actually want? Is it, do I want complete silence? Do I want somebody to just make it as if it's a normal day? Like, how do we manage these feelings that are extreme on both sides of the spectrum, both the person who has experienced the loss, but also for the people who are trying to support the people who experience the loss? Like, do you have any suggestions? Or, I know it's probably
Yeah.
very customized to the individuals, but just out of curiosity.
I was going to say, I mean, it's definitely, there's no right answer for that, because I mean, I was going to say on a daily basis, but even like on an hourly basis or a minute basis, it's like it can change with, I want someone to talk to me right now. And then the next minute, it's like, I just want to be alone. And another thing that that a supporter could ask someone is, oh, what makes you think of this person? I'm big into signs, like different signs, whether it's like, oh, you see hearts everywhere, or like, especially if whoever that person is, especially if it was an adult, usually there's something about that person that reminded you of them when they were here. And oftentimes you'll get signs from that person in regards to that, whatever that thing is. And so if you ask like, oh, what reminds you of your spouse, or what reminds me of your kid or your sibling, and see what they say. And then like if you see that thing, like, so for us, like foxes are a theme for us with James. And it's something that it's so interesting how it came about. We just ended up seeing a fox in our backyard. It was, I mean, it had been 2 years, almost 3 years after he died, when we started seeing these foxes. And I'm just like, I feel like that's a sign from him. And I didn't even realize until we went back and started looking at pictures, and the pictures of the day that he came home from the hospital, he had a onesie on that had fox prints on it and like little fox booties on his feet. And I'm like, oh my gosh, like that's totally him. And so when you see that thing, so now people are like, oh my gosh, just saw a fox. Or like people will send me pictures of foxes, whether it's a live fox or a cartoon fox or something like that. And that just like makes me so happy. And so that is a great thing to ask someone. Because then when you see that thing, you can say, hey, I just saw this and thought of your person. And that will just light them up. Just you thinking about them and thinking about their person is so valuable. And so there, again, it's like another big thing that comes up is so often it's like we feel alone and isolated. And at the same time, it's like we might not want to go out and do anything. We want to kind of be alone, but we don't want to feel like we're alone. We want to make sure, or not make sure, but it's like we don't want to feel like we're alone. So something that is so important, and that people who are grieving need to make sure they're communicating this. And that's the thing, is like what I try to tell people too that are grieving. It's like, it's, there's all these things that people say that are inappropriate or whatever, but then it also comes down to your communication with other people too, and you setting boundaries and saying what you want. And so often we feel like we are left out of things, or because people will invite you to something, like let's say it's like, oh, we're going out for drinks. I know that doesn't happen that often right now, but it's like, oh, we're going out for drinks. And then you say, oh, I don't feel like going. But then they invite you again, and then you say, okay, I'm going to go, but then you cancel last minute because you just don't feel like going. And then all of a sudden they just stop inviting you because they feel like, oh, well, she just doesn't want to come. When in reality, we so appreciate the invite, but we just can't get ourselves to do it yet. So continuing to invite those people until they say, don't invite me anymore. And as the grieving person, make sure you tell people, say, I so appreciate you inviting me every time. Please keep inviting me. And just know that if I'm canceling, it has nothing to do with you. It's just me. I just can't do it right now. But know that I really appreciate you inviting me to whatever it is, because that's where that loneliness and isolation happens. I feel like is we say no to so many things because we're not ready for it yet. And then people think that we don't want to be invited anymore. And then that's how all like relationships start being like, oh, I don't feel like I have any friends anymore because nobody invites me to do anything. And it's because, we've been saying no so much, but it's not that we don't appreciate being invited. So I hope that helps a little bit.
Absolutely. The Fox idea is awesome, by the way. That is
Yeah.
really, really cool. And it's a great tactic too. Like, because then you can always like, hey, Michelle, like here's a Fox, and then it makes you feel like that's just from a supporter's perspective. I think that's a really neat idea. And I do like that. You kind of summed it up in a nice way of like communication is how you help manage those emotional strikes. And I think it's probably on both sides. I would assume that you'd probably say from a supporter's perspective saying like, hey, I want to invite you, but if you can't make it, totally understand, but we're just going to continue to invite you until you say no, like I'm just going to continue to do this until you can't, which is awesome. And Nathaniel was here. He'd be like, yes, communication. He would hammer that. To kind of take a little bit of a different road. This is coming more from the finance perspective, is obviously your people would be coping with a loss. And that in itself is something that is why we're talking about is difficult. For multiple reasons. And what also can be really hard is then the financial burden of maybe putting someone to rest, however that may come to be for that family or that individual. And so I guess just like Dan asked about the grieving process, like where do you begin? Like, where do you begin with it? How do you kind of go about it? Can you just give us any insight on cost or things that come up with when it comes from the financial perspective due to someone, your person's passing?
Yeah. And that, again, it depends on that person. But I mean, definitely like funeral costs are very expensive. And whether you decide on burial or cremation or whatever you decide, there's a lot of costs that are involved in that. And then, I mean, there's even beyond that, like if the person had other bills and that kind of stuff too, is like having something set up ahead of time is so important. And with the child, it's like we didn't have anything set up for James. He was only 12 weeks old when he died. And for us, we were fortunate enough that the funeral home we went to, they don't charge for children's funerals. So we didn't have that burden. We had to pay for like flowers and things like that. But like the main cost of the funeral, we didn't have to pay for, thankfully, because I mean, it's over $10,000 for sure as how much it would have cost. And it's like, we wouldn't have, I don't know where we would, we would have had to find family. And I know we would have been supported in that way, but not everyone is as lucky to have that support. And so, I mean, we've had life insurance for a long time for each of us, but like life insurance can be so valuable. Especially like, I know you guys like term life insurance and that kind of stuff. It's so valuable because you can get so much for such a small amount, especially for young people. And I know too, it was an awakening for us to be like, okay, we really need to do something for some sort of will for me and my husband for our living daughter. We need to have something in place. It's like stuff that you don't want to do, but honestly, the earlier you do it, the better it is. Because I mean, the chances of us dying are very low. You know, we're healthy people, but that doesn't mean we can't die tomorrow. It doesn't mean we can't die today. But it to me, it's like, it's kind of hard to start talking about it, but then it's like, I mean, the reality is it's probably not going to happen, but it's good to have something in place in case something does happen. And especially, you know, especially pre-pandemic, when it's like, if you, talking about kids at least, it's like if you and your partner go traveling a lot and you leave your kids at home, you know, and something happens on vacation, that's really important to have something in place, because that just, you know, that's just going to increase the possibility of like something happening to both of you at the same exact time. So having things in place can be really helpful, but it is a really big burden, a financial burden when somebody dies, unfortunately. But it's like there's two guarantees in life, taxes and death, right? Like it's like those are both going to happen. So like, and that's why talking about these things, and they don't have to always be like sad, and like it doesn't have to be so like arduous, and just be like, hey, it's going to happen, so why don't we try and prepare a little bit for it.
I'm glad you brought that up. I mean, you just never know. The even things like, you know, what we've seen, which I guess this can kind of bridge the question I had here, or the topic, I guess. It cannot be an easy thing to deal with the loss and the emotions that come from that. And then also the burden of some of the things that you just spoke about from a financial standpoint, having to pay for those costs. Or some people may be fortunate enough where their employers will give them some paid time off, if the employer is even able to do that. But having enough cash on hand from an emergency fund standpoint is also key here too, because what if you don't have that ability and going back to work just isn't at play? So balancing those things, I'm sure, is very difficult. This next question, I guess, is kind of a question, kind of a brainstorming piece. From what we've seen, and I would think that you've seen some of this stuff too, but people don't talk about it, and how to handle the situation in that point of emotions and finances coming together. Is just if we could spend some time talking about some of the behavioral adjustments. You know, on this podcast and in our practice, we talk a lot about the qualitative elements of finance, the behavioral components. And so we've seen on our end adjustments that of course happen, but they look very different. We've seen it many times over where one spouse or partner is handling a lot of the financial pieces. And when they go, that other person feels very lost often and doesn't know what to do. And there are adjustments that have to be made there. We've seen it where people, when they deal with any kind of pain, will use, and again, this is not meant to make a judgment, it makes perfect sense, but they'll use either saving money or spending money as a coping mechanism to be able to divert or handle the situation, you know, at hand. We've obviously seen people that have been very fearful and have not been able to act because they see a burden of debt out there. But the financial landscape changes quite a bit. So just curious about what you've maybe seen from a behavior adjustment and how else it could impact conversations that revolve around money.
Yeah, I mean, that is, and you're so right. It's like and that's what I love about you guys too, is like, even just thinking about how we work with our family, it's like figuring out, making sure we're doing stuff for the future, but also saying like, well, we want to enjoy our life, right? Because like we said, it's like, yeah, chances are we're going to die in old age, but also I don't want to like save all my money for retirement and not enjoy my life before that. And making sure we're setting aside money for vacations or, you know, fun toys or whatever we want. Again, it's like within reason, but you're right. It's like some people do. I mean, I feel like, especially with grief and loss, it's like everyone has some sort of addiction that they use as like a coping mechanism. And it can be spending a lot of money. And that's one thing, is like there's so many different beautiful things that you can get to have like mementos and things of your loved one. We were lucky enough to get a lot of those things, so we didn't buy them ourselves, but it's like so often it's like you're grasping for anything that makes you think of your person, that you're just like, oh my gosh, there, look at this wind chime, it's so beautiful. And like we got an amazing wind chime from my sister and brother-in-law, and I'm so thankful. Like I love it, and anytime I hear it, it makes me think of James. And then it's like we have another little like rainbow crystal in our window that when the sun shines on it, it shines rainbows in our house, and those things. And then you can get like jewelry, and then there's different like candles or like pictures. There's all sorts of things you can get to remind you of your person, but remembering that it's like it's not really going to change who, like, that they're not here. And so, and that can be so hard because you're in such an emotional state that, again, it's like you're grasping at like, oh, I want to do this, I want to do this, but just knowing like, okay, like taking a breath and letting yourself say, okay, is this something that I really want, or am I just trying to grasp at all of these things that will, I'm trying to make myself feel better, but I know in reality it's not going to make me feel better. And so like people will tend to like buy these different things, or like you said too, it's like just hold on to everything and be afraid. Yeah, it's hard because it's so emotional. And I feel like too, it's like at one point you can be like, okay, I want to just go do something, and then the very next day it's like, oh my gosh, I can't spend any money anymore. And it's, I mean, it's hard. It's so emotional, and the emotion isn't the same all the time. It's peaks and valleys of different emotions.
One that we've seen quite a bit that I don't think a lot of people would expect is guilt. So, and especially when somebody passing means an inheritance received or life insurance proceeds come into play, is we've seen a lot of people feel tremendous guilt that they are perhaps in a better financial situation now, but the other person doesn't get to enjoy that because that situation changes because that person is no longer here. And that we've seen that put a significant stress on people before, that I don't, unless you've gone through it, I don't know that most people expect to experience something like that. It just seems like this wide array of emotions, that it is all over the place, and there is no textbook on it, but it is all okay, but you could experience everything.
Yeah. And I mean, and guilt is probably one of the most common feelings. And whether you got an inheritance, or it's like, I feel guilty enjoying life, I feel guilty laughing, and I feel guilty doing these things, or it's like, I feel guilty because I get to go on this fabulous vacation because I got this inheritance or whatever. It's like, yeah, there's so much guilt, but just knowing that it's like that they don't want you to suffer. Like they don't want you to be sad all the time either. They want you to be happy and feeling love and joy. And that can be a hard place to get to. But that, like, they don't want you to just be sad all the time. And you can be thinking about them when you're having fun too. And that's even better. And I mean, that's definitely one thing this past year. I was like, with everything with the pandemic and like hunkering down so much, all of a sudden I realized, like in June, I just went to Jared, my husband. I'm like, we need to like do something. What are we doing? Like, we need to go like live a little bit, because I like this is not who we were before. And I mean, luckily for us, when James was here, we did lots of things. Like we went to the apple orchard, we went to the Taste of Madison over Labor Day weekend, we went to the zoo with him, like all these little things that didn't seem like super exciting necessarily at the time, but I'm so thankful because we have all those little memories. And it's like you can create more new memories and you can involve that, like keep them with you. Like I have my charm necklace. So it's like, if you have a charm necklace or something like that, that you bring along with, or maybe, I mean, some people even bring their urns with, if you really want to go that far. I mean, I don't know flying if I would do that personally, but um or bringing a candle or a picture along that's always with you, so they're with you on these adventures, and you don't have to bring anything physical, they're always with you. And just knowing that it's like, yeah, they want you to live life in an excited, fun way, and not just being sad all the time. And there's no, you don't need to feel the guilt, even though I know it's hard to not feel the guilt, but you don't need to feel guilty about having fun and enjoying life. Because if you think about when they were here, hopefully they were doing that same thing, and they wouldn't want you to stop just because they're not physically here.
I like that. I like that a lot. Especially with, that guilt, which I have not experienced, so I can't give my opinion on what that's like, but I can imagine that is very difficult, and to have to kind of reframe it in the way that's like, they would want you to, they would want you to go and be happy and enjoy, because that's what you want for them and that's what they want for you. And it's a really nice reminder, even though I know it probably is not easy in the moment or at the time to be in that type of framework of mind. But I like the charm too. I like the charm idea. It's really neat.
Yeah.
So my last question for you, Michelle, and I'm curious, just for our listeners and our viewers, this obviously, like you said, can be a very tough topic. Doesn't always have to be, which I do appreciate you saying that as well. But I'm just curious for people who are listening or watching, like, what is out there for like, what other resources are there for people to learn more about this, or to get help if they are struggling with a loss of a loved one, or a person just in general? Dick, do you have any suggestions for our viewers and listeners?
So a nationwide organization that's really great is the Compassionate Friends group. I believe that's specifically for child loss, but it's not just for parents. I believe that's for like maybe young siblings. I know it's for grandparents too, but Compassionate Friends is a great organization that does amazing things around. And so that's a great organization. And there are local support groups here in Madison, and some I know are trying to get back to getting together in person, because in person can be so valuable and helpful. So I think like support groups are really important, and finding one that fits as well, I think, is very important too. I know for me, I started looking up different Facebook groups and things, and it was helpful at first because I felt less alone, because it was, oh, these people understand me. But then I got to a point where I was in the groups and it made me actually feel more depressed, because you're just hearing all these stories over and over again. So I kind of left them for a little while, and just finding that groove of like what is helping you and not keeping you like in a stuck place or in depression or whatever that is. It's like, again, it's like, I feel like there's a time and place for each different type of support. And then, I'm a big advocate for therapy, but that can be difficult right now too, to find a therapist, and to find one that, again, find one that works for you.
Thanks, Michelle. It
Yeah.
just leaving a last thought here. Takeaways for those trying to or wanting to support other people. I think we talked about that. You shared some really great tidbits and thoughts on that, Michelle. It's not your job to make people happy. You mentioned that a couple times. I think it's really important. It is nice if you feel up to it and can include them, and not to put pressure and try, even though it's hard. You're not walking through their steps, but to understand that they may not be avoiding you, but maybe struggling to the point that keep on making the invitation. And that's a huge part of support. I love that you mentioned, use the name of a lost person. That is important, right? we've read before too, that it's the greatest gift you can give anybody is their name. So it is important to use it. And just something you just said, for those who are grieving that loss, it's okay to ask for help when you feel like you're ready for that, and go at your pace, because those emotions can be anything. And your life will be different. It will impact all elements of your life, but it will be different. That's okay. And it's okay to ask for help there too, as you basically get to a point where you form what life looks like going forward.
Yes. Thank you again, Michelle. I'll reiterate Dan's thank you. I think that the few things that I really liked is I really love the fox. I really enjoy the fox, and seeing the fox in that sign. I think that can bring somebody a lot of joy in having that. And I think it's so cool that you went back and looked at James's onesie when he was born with the fox feet. Like that's just it's just really neat story. I appreciate you for saying that. And I really do like the pendant or the idea of always carrying that person with you, to help you continue to live a life of purpose, as you mentioned, both in your bio and just throughout this whole podcast. I also think too that when it comes to guilt, I think that's a really important subject. And to tie it back in a little bit on the finance side, is it's just a really interesting concept, because people then will feel guilty about the decisions they made under that distress. And what's really hard though, is that if you really think about it, people always will consider that as an irrational move, right? Because but what you're really doing is it's not irrational at the time, because you're trying to solve something that maybe not be solved by the right thing, but you get consumed by it. And it happens to everyone. Doesn't matter if you're smart, you're intelligent, emotions do play a role. And it happens. And to feel guilty about it, once let's say you stop doing it or something, it's not necessarily always a bad thing. Like you said, that wind chime, that means the world to you. So if you spent $100 on a wind chime and it's going to remind you of your person for the rest of your life, I would say that was the most well worth $100 you've ever spent, and you probably will ever spend. And so it's really kind of putting into context of the value of the dollar that's being spent. And sometimes the value of that dollar does not equate to more money. It equates to more happiness, or it equates to being able to get out of depression, or it helps equate to a qualitative return. And that's not talked enough about, because there is a return there. And yes, there's always a balance. Life is about balance. But at the end of the day, that's something that you shouldn't feel guilty about. You should actually be very happy about, because look at how much value it brings, right? It's massive. It's priceless, right? Discover it's priceless. You can't put a price on that. And so that is something that I appreciate. It was as a conversation topic, and we see it a lot, that people will feel bad about it. And it's like, well, what does it do for you? And then they'll say comments like that. And it's like, oh, absolutely not. You should never feel guilty about that purchase. It's a purchase that really makes you feel better, and for a lot of different reasons. So I just really appreciate you bringing up your own story and jumping on our podcast, because this is a difficult conversation, but it's one that should be had and continue to have over time. So as always, we'll leave it to you, Michelle, for last comments. So any comments that you have would be great.
Yeah, something that came up when you were talking with the guilt is something that I talk to my clients about so often, is when you're talking about like people feeling guilty about maybe something that sometimes they can feel guilty about what happened leading up to that person's death. Like, oh, I wish I could have done more or something like that to save that person. Or the guilt of like, oh my gosh, I just spent all this money. And what I always tell people is you can't change what you did in the past, and you feeling guilty about it now isn't going to change it. So really trying to get people to a place of awareness and not judgment, or like curiosity instead of judgment. Ask yourself, well, why did I spend all that money? And if I don't like the fact that I spent all that money on this stuff, what can I do differently next time? So if it's like, oh, I felt like I spent too much money on all these different trinkets and things. Okay, next time I want one, I'm going to give myself 24 hours. I'm going to, pray about it maybe, or just like take a few deep breaths and say like, is this something that's really important to me? Because sometimes, like you said, sometimes it is. That is what you need. And so not judging yourself for your past decisions, because you can't change who you were, and you were a different person. Even if it was just a few hours ago, it's like you were a different person yesterday. You're a different person now, and not judging yourself for those decisions that you made, because you can't change it and you can only change moving forward.
Thank you, Michelle. And thank you for sharing all of your experiences, your own experience, your expertise. We know this will be very helpful, we hope, and to many people. And so thank you for joining us today. And thank you to our audience for always tuning in and hearing these great guest speakers that we are so privileged to bring to you. Have a great evening and take care of yourselves.
Thank you for taking the time to start your journey of thinking differently and listening to LBW talk about stuff they love. Until next time.